Peppa Pig, Eyes in the Dark. In the Pig family's house, an unusual silence reigned. Lately, George had hardly spoken to his sister. He no longer played with his dinosaur, didn't ask for bedtime stories, and didn't laugh the way he used to. Instead, he spent long hours sitting at the table by the window, clutching a pencil. Sheets of paper were scattered everywhere, on the floor, on the chair, even by the bed. All of them were covered with the same strange symbols, circles with short lines, resembling eyes. "George, what are these drawings?" Peppa asked cautiously. Her brother slowly turned to her. His gaze was unusual, heavy, and somehow too grown up. "You'll find out soon," he whispered, and bent over the papers again. Peppa felt her little hooves grow cold. George was becoming more and more withdrawn, as if his attention was fixed on something she couldn't see. One night, when they were both already lying in their beds, Peppa noticed that George wasn't asleep. He sat right on his sheets, staring at the ceiling. His eyes shimmered strangely, reflecting the moonlight. But there was no warmth in that gleam. It felt as if a bottomless depth was hiding inside them, one she could fall into. "George," Peppa whispered. He didn't answer. He only smiled, in a way he had never smiled before. The next morning, George's bed was empty. His favorite dinosaur lay torn to pieces on the floor. Above his pillow, on the wall, scratches had appeared. Symbols like eyes, as if someone had carved them with a sharp claw. "George!" Peppa called. But the room remained silent. She rushed through the house, searching for her brother in the garden, the kitchen, the living room. But George was nowhere. Everything around her felt too quiet, as if time itself had stopped. When Peppa returned to their room, her eyes fell on the large mirror hanging on the wall. Her heart froze. In the reflection behind her stood George. She spun around quickly. No one was there. But in the mirror, he remained, staring. His eyes glowed with a dim, sickly light, and his lips stretched into a smile. Peppa backed away, and then she noticed that next to George in the reflection sat Labubu. The toy looked almost the same as always, but its eyes flickered with a red glow. On its face lingered the same eerie smile as George's. "George is no more," came a strange voice from the mirror. It was low, drawn out, and echoed both in the room and inside her head. Peppa pressed herself to the wall. The surface of the mirror rippled like water. The shapes of George and Labubu moved forward, toward the glass. Their outlines became sharper, as if they were about to break through. "No!" Peppa screamed. She dashed toward the door, but suddenly froze. In the mirror, her own bed reflected as empty, and on it sat Labubu, very close now, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. The mirror trembled, and the shadows nearly tore their way out. Peppa squeezed her eyes shut, unable to look. When she opened them again, the mirror was ordinary. The room was silent. Only George's bed remained empty. Later that night, when their parents had gone to sleep, Peppa sat on her bed, staring at the shelf where Labubu now stood again. He looked harmless, soft, and familiar. But now she knew the truth. His eyes were no longer lifeless buttons. In their dim glow flickered the same cold emptiness she had seen in George. And in the corner of the room, near the mirror, a crack was slowly spreading. It widened, as if something unseen was watching from behind the wall.
Scary Peppa Pig episode that never made it on TV. Daddy Pig was in his study, engrossed in his newspaper. But the rustling of the pages sounded like dry, brittle wings. The antique globe on his desk spun slowly on its own, its continents shifting and blurring. A faint, musty smell filled the room. The ink on the newspaper began to bleed, forming strange, cryptic symbols. Daddy Pig seemed oblivious. The bookshelves appeared to lean precariously. A cold draft swept through the room. Peppa tiptoed to the study door. The familiar ticking of Daddy Pig /S watch had morphed into a slow, deliberate thumping. The air grew heavy. The symbols on the newspaper began to glow with a faint, sickly green light. Daddy Pig looked up, his eyes wide and unseeing. He spoke, but his voice was not his own. He gestured towards the globe, which now pulsed with the same green light. The continents on it rearranged themselves into a map of an unknown, terrifying place. The books on the shelves began to fall. The study was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. Peppa backed away, her heart pounding. The thumping of the watch grew louder. The green light intensified. Daddy Pig rose from his chair, his movements stiff and unnatural. The study door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The air grew thick with an unseen presence. The house was no longer a home, but a predator. The finality of her fate hung heavy in the air. The walls seemed to close in. There was no escape, no hope. Only the hungry silence and the unblinking eye of their doom. The house had claimed its prize, and the game was over. For now.
Peppa Pig, The Cracks. It started as just a tiny line, almost invisible in the corner of Peppa's bedroom. She thought it was just a crack in the paint. Maybe someone had bumped into the wall. "Mummy, look," she said that evening, pointing. Mummy Pig glanced over, nodded and said, "The house has probably settled a bit. Nothing to worry about. Daddy will fix it." But Daddy forgot, and the crack stayed. The next day, Peppa noticed it had grown longer. Now it stretched upward slightly, like a tree branch reaching toward the ceiling. "That's strange," she muttered. "Maybe I'm imagining it." But each day, the crack grew, first thin, then a little wider. After a few days, it curved unnaturally, like someone had drawn it with a finger. More cracks appeared nearby, one, then another. "Is our house okay?" Peppa asked Daddy Pig. "Of course," he laughed. "Walls crack sometimes. We'll fix it." They never did. A week later, the whole wall was laced with thin cracks. Some of them vanished during the day, only to return by night. One night, Peppa woke up and saw the crack moving, slightly, as if something inside was breathing. She got out of bed and walked closer, pressed her ear against it. Inside, a sound. Very quiet, scraping. A knock, slow, 3 taps, a pause, 2 more. Peppa jumped back. "George," she whispered. Her brother was asleep, breathing steadily. In the morning, she found a small, dusty scrap of paper beneath the crack, very old, almost falling apart. On it, a single word, "Open." Peppa didn't tell her parents. She covered the crack with bandages, several layers, then hung a picture over it. But by nightfall, the picture had fallen. The tape was torn away. New lines appeared on the wall, not cracks anymore, almost like letters. She backed away to the door, but the door wouldn't open. Something inside the wall was moving, slowly, like it was exhaling. She screamed. Mummy and Daddy rushed in. It's," Peppa gasped, pointing. But on the wall, nothing, no cracks, no words, just a perfectly smooth surface. "You probably had a bad dream," said Mummy Pig gently. "Let's try to forget about it." But Peppa couldn't forget, because that night, when she turned to face the wall, she saw movement right where the crack had been, and then a voice, a whisper. "I'm almost out. Don't turn around." Peppa Pig, The Wrong Drawing. It started quietly, almost unnoticed. George was quietly sitting at the kitchen table with crayons and a large sheet of paper. Daddy Pig was sipping tea. Mummy Pig was reading a magazine. Peppa came closer and saw George was drawing children. "Is that your class?" she asked. "Yes," he nodded. "All of them." In the drawing stood Rebecca, Zoe, Pedro, Danny, everyone Peppa knew. But they all had the same eyes, black dots. Their smiles were long and flat. They stood in the same pose, arms hanging down, on a white background. Even George's dinosaur was drawn, a bit to the side and with the same eyes. "Why are you drawing them?" "Just so they'll be here, always." Peppa frowned but said nothing. The next morning at school, the teacher said Rebecca didn't come in, then Zoe didn't come, then Pedro. Every day someone was missing, no explanations, no notes from parents. "Maybe they're sick," said Mummy Pig. "All at once," Peppa whispered. One evening, she walked into George's room and saw him drawing again. Another sheet, the same figures, the same emptiness. But now there were shadows in the background, long, like the sun was shining from behind, and their eyes were different, darker, deeper. "What is this?" "They're standing, still. You didn't draw me too, did you?" He didn't answer. Peppa went to the drawer and pulled out the old drawings, all the same, and each time someone disappeared in real life, but appeared again on paper. That night, she woke up. The nightlight flickered. The room was cold. George was standing at the door, holding a piece of paper in his hooves. "I drew you," he said. "George, please." Peppa's heart started to pound. "You're standing in the back of the class, next to Rebecca." "I don't want to. I shouldn't be there." Too late. He stepped closer, showed her the drawing. Peppa looked at her image. It was empty, no eyes, no mouth, just a silhouette. And at the bottom of the page, a note. "You're the last one." Peppa tore the drawing from George's hooves, ran to the kitchen, and threw it into the stove. The paper caught fire. She waited until it turned to ash. But when she turned around, George stood at the door with a new sheet. I remembered it. That night, she locked her door, shut the window, hid the crayons. But she still heard scratching on the floor. Steady, slow. In the morning, she opened the desk drawer. A paper lay there, blank. Only in the corner, a faint shadow, small, shaped like her, and a note. "It's already too late." Peppa Pig The Sleep. It all began quietly. A normal day. The kitchen smelled like toast. Mummy Pig stirred her tea. Daddy Pig read the newspaper, occasionally grunting and turning a page. George was drawing a dinosaur. Peppa sat by the window. The sun looked pale, almost glassy. The sky was light, but without light, as if the day was only pretending to be day. Everything seemed normal, until the evening. George was the first to fall asleep, early. Right at the table, with his head on his arms, he didn't say a word, didn't yawn, he just closed his eyes. Peppa tried to wake him, shook his shoulder, called his name. No reaction. He was breathing calmly. His face was peaceful. Daddy Pig carried him to bed. Mummy Pig said softly, "He must be tired." But her eyes looked uneasy. The next morning, Mummy Pig didn't wake up. She lay still, as if in a deep sleep. Peppa called to her, shook her gently. Nothing, just slow breathing. Her lips slightly parted. Daddy Pig said nothing. He brought her tea. Nothing. Shook her. No response. He just stood there, staring, clutching the newspaper. The next day, Daddy Pig fell asleep too, in his chair, newspaper on his lap, eyes open. Peppa leaned in. He didn't blink, didn't move, but his chest rose and fell, as if breathing, but not on purpose. Peppa was alone. At first, she tried to follow the usual routine, made herself breakfast, sat by the window, drew pictures, talked out loud. But the house felt different. The air, heavy, the rooms, strangely empty. Her footsteps made no echo, as if the house was no longer real. She went outside. The path was clear. No footprints, no breeze. The world had stopped. Peppa knocked on neighbors' doors, called out, rang doorbells. Silence. Behind the windows, silhouettes, some lying down, some sitting, all still. Everyone was asleep. She walked through the town. It was spotless. Benches, empty, shops, open but abandoned. A shopping cart stood in the middle of an aisle, as if someone let go of it and vanished. Each day grew quieter. Even the birds had stopped singing. Every sound Peppa made felt muted. She banged on pots, bounced a ball off the wall, dropped a plate. Everything sounded distant, as if she were underwater. On the third day, she returned home, sat between her parents and George. They were still breathing, warm, but not alive. She looked in the mirror. Her reflection stared back. Same face, same eyes. She blinked, turned away, then looked back. The reflection hadn't blinked. She walked closer. It sat slightly straighter, looked deeper, still unmoving. That night, her body grew heavier. Eyes refused to stay open. Her limbs slowed. Her head dipped. But inside, a voice whispered, "Don't sleep." Peppa lay down next to George, held him, listened to him breathe, slowly, calmly. She didn't want to close her eyes, but they closed anyway. And just before she slipped away, she looked one last time at the mirror. Her reflection was still sitting there, watching her, staring straight ahead, eyes wide open, still, unblinking.
Peppa Pig The Tunnel. It started on an ordinary day. Peppa and George were walking to the park. The weather was calm, the sky pale white, no sun, no rain. Peppa held George's hoof. He was quieter than usual. They passed the swings, the benches, and then George stopped. Peppa looked ahead. Between the bushes was an opening that hadn't been there before. The ground dipped slightly, like it had sunken. The entrance was low, stone-lined. Too neat, too precise. Peppa frowned. George let go of her hoof and stepped forward, without a word, calmly, as if he knew where he was going. She called out, but he was already gone. The tunnel was darker than it should have been. The light from behind didn't reach in. Peppa entered. One step, then another, until she was surrounded by thick, sticky silence. She walked along the narrow stone passage, each step echoing dull and strange, like the ground wasn't quite ground. The walls weren't wet, but they smelled of damp stone, and the air felt perfectly still, like no breeze, no echo. When Peppa stepped out, she found herself in the park. At first glance, the same one, but something was off. The trees were taller, their branches too symmetrical. The swings hung still, even with no wind. The grass was pale, the sound muffled, no birds. The park sign had the same shape, but the letters were wrong. They looked copied, like someone had drawn them from memory. She walked home. It was where it should be. Same roof, same windows, but the door hung crooked, and on it was a plaque that read, "The Pig Family," written in a style that wasn't theirs. Inside, the house smelled like home, but only in the hallway. Further in, the scent vanished. The kitchen had 3 cups, one half full, 2 empty and unwashed. Daddy Pig was sitting at the table, but when she blinked, the chair was empty. The family photos on the wall looked old. They showed her, George, Mummy, Daddy, but the faces were wrong. Office. Like someone tried to recreate them from memory. She went upstairs to her room. The toys were in the right places, but George's dinosaur had blue eyes, not black, and her favorite doll was facing the wall. She had never left it like that. Peppa opened the wardrobe. Only one dress hung inside, red, like hers, but far too big. On the windowsill lay a drawing, done in pencil. It showed the tunnel. Beneath it, a note in a child's writing, "I'm inside." In the backyard stood another tunnel, wider, not the same, but similar. Peppa peered in. Nothing, just darkness. On the ground before it sat a pale stone. Pressed into it, a small hoof print. She walked back to the park. It was still empty, but on every bench lay a toy, each one slightly wrong. A doll with 2 left legs, a bear with both eyes on one side. Returning home took longer. Each step stretched. When she arrived, the door was open. On the hallway floor, footprints, wet, leading inward. The lights were on inside, but when she called out, no one answered. By the 4th day, she stopped calling. The tunnel behind the house was gone. The photos on the wall had faded, and in her room, another dress, smaller. In the kitchen, 4 cups. One was new. On it was the name Peppa, but not in her handwriting. Sometimes at night she hears footsteps in the hallway and a child's voice, software, not quite her own. It calls someone by name, and each time she feels more certain it's calling her.
Peppa Pig The Smile Game. It all started on an ordinary day. During recess, under a grey sky, the children were playing in the schoolyard. Peppa sat on a bench next to Susie. Rebecca was building a tower out of sticks. Danny was chasing a ball. And Candy just stood there, watching, for a long time, without blinking. Then she said, "Let's play a game. Who can smile the longest?" Everyone laughed. "But there are rules," she added. "No blinking, no looking away, and no stopping." "What's the prize?" asked Pedro. Candy smiled. "The winner stays." They stood in a circle. 6 children, 6 faces, 6 smiles. At first it was fun. They giggled, made faces. Someone even sneezed from laughing too hard. But soon the silence thickened. The smiles froze. Their eyes grew tense. Time seemed to slow down. No one knew how long they had been standing there. Seconds? Minutes? Pedro gave up first. He squinted and turned away. Then Rebecca. Her eyes were watering. She blinked, almost with relief. 3 remained: Peppa, Susie, and Candy. No one spoke, only smiles, only staring eyes. Susie blinked. Candy won. But she didn't stop smiling, even when the game was over. The next day, Susie didn't come to school. "She's sick," said the teacher. But she said it too quickly. No details. Pedro was gone too, and Rebecca. Candy sat at her desk, the same smile on her face. She didn't blink the entire lesson. She wrote, ate, breathed, without blinking. Even when others whispered, even when the teacher called her name, she just stared and smiled. At recess, Peppa approached her. "Where's Susie?" she whispered. Candy slowly turned her head and smiled even wider. So wide her cheeks looked stretched. No words, no blinking. That evening, Peppa couldn't eat. She kept remembering the circle, the eyes, the smiles, how hard it was to breathe when no one was laughing, just holding their faces. Her mother noticed. "Everything okay, Peppa? If someone smiles too long, is that normal?" Mummy paused. "It just means they're very happy," she said, and turned away. That night, Peppa woke up. A rustling sound outside her window. She got up and looked into the dark. At the edge of the road, beneath the street lamp, sat Candy. The same smile, the same wide eyes, 2 white teeth, too still. Peppa backed away, closed the curtains, went to the mirror in her room, looked at her own face, and for a moment, her reflection smiled before she did. The next morning, Candy wasn't at school, but on Peppa's desk lay a white sheet of paper. On it, a circle. Inside, a face. Too simple, too wide a smile, black dot eyes. And beneath it, in thin writing, "Now you." When Peppa looked up, the classroom was empty, except for the mirror in the corner, and in it, her reflection, already smiling.